Hello everyone, we are the group 6 and the person who's talking right now is myself Arlene Jade Geiger and my member is Miss Marisol Galo Macra. So now, I will be discussing what is a virtue theory. But before that, let us first discuss what is a virtue. So what is a virtue? A virtue is a behavior showing high moral standards. Another meaning is that a virtue is a trait or quality that is deemed to be morally good and thus is valued as a foundation of principle and good moral being. In other words, it is a behavior that shows high moral standards, doing what is right and avoiding what is wrong. The opposite of virtue is vice. Virtues. Trained behavioral dispositions that result in habitual acts of moral goodness. The opposite mental quality is that of a vice. Trained behavioral dispositions that result in habitual acts of moral wrongness. An entire ethical system called virtue theory or virtue ethics is based on this notion. A central theme of which is that morality involves producing excellent persons who act well out of spontaneous goodness and serve as examples to inspire others. The nature of ethics. Virtues are excellences of character, trained behavioral dispositions that result in habitual acts. And traditionally, they have been divided into two types, moral and non-moral virtues. Moral virtues is honesty, benevolence, non-malevolence, fairness, kindness, conscientiousness, and gratitude. And non-moral virtues are courage, optimism, rationality, self-control, patience, endurance, industry, musical talent, cleanliness, and wit. So the exact classification of various virtues is debatable. Courage sometimes falls into the moral category, and virtues such as kindness as opposed to impartial benevolence might fit into either category. The moral virtues are more closely associated with what has been deemed essential for the moral life and incompatible with the immoral life. But the distinction seems rough and inexact because many of the moral virtues could be used for bad purposes. For example, the benevolent person who has an inclination for making things worse. The non-moral virtues, while generally seen as contributing to the moral life, are more easily expropriated for immoral purposes. For example, the courageous criminal who is more dangerous than the cowardly one. So now, let's talk about the ideal type of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In Aristotle's classic work on the virtues, Nicomachean Ethics, he identified the virtues as simply those characteristics that enable individuals to live well in communities, to achieve a state of well-being, from the Greek word eudaimonia, meaning happiness or human flourishing. Proper social institutions are necessary. Thus, the moral person cannot really exist apart from a flourishing political setting that enables him or her to develop the required virtues for the good life. Aristotle explains that the moral virtues are different from the intellectual ones, whereas the intellectual virtues may be taught directly. The moral ones must be lived to be learned. By living well, we acquire the right habits. These habits are in fact the virtues. The virtues are to be sought as the best guarantee to the happy life. The ideal individual. The saints and moral heroes are the salt by which the world is preserved. In an influential article, Moral Saints, philosopher Susan Wolf argues that moral saints are unattractive because they lack the ability to enjoy the enjoyable in life, and are so very nice that they must be dull-witted or humorless or bland. Their lives are strangely barren. But is this true? Are the lives of the above listed people dull-witted or humorless or bland? One may doubt it. And there is nothing strangely barren about Jesus embodying the spirit of love, putting high altruism to practice as never before seen, accepting the pariahs of society, and bring out their innate dignity. Altruism means the belief in or practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. Other meaning of altruism refers to behavior that benefits another individual at a cost to oneself. For example, giving your lunch away is altruistic because it helps someone who is hungry, but at the cost of being hungry yourself. Criticisms of action-based ethics. Historically, virtue theory was a dominant player in moral philosophy for 2000 years, and philosophers who followed Aristotle made virtues the centerpiece of their systems. But even non-Aristotelian philosophers gave virtue a prominent role, a good example being Thomas Hobbes. For Hobbes, morality emerges through a series of social agreements that we make with each other as we attempt to leave a state of war and enter one of peace. We agree to keep our contracts, show gratitude toward others, be sociable, avoid signs of hatred toward others, compromise on our differences, and several other rules that ensure peace. In essence, then, there are two general approaches to moral theories: an action-based approach, advocated by utilitarian and deontological philosophers, and a virtue-based approach, defended by virtue theorists. In their most extreme forms, here are their principal differences. Virtue-based theory. 1. We should acquire good character traits, not simply act according to moral rules. 2. Morality involves being a virtuous person. Action-based theory. Number 1, we should act properly by following moral rules. Number 2, we judge people based on how they act, not on whether they are virtuous people. Virtue-based ethics centers in the heart of the agent, in his or her character, and emphasizes being rather than merely doing. The crucial moral question for this approach is, what sort of person should I become? Virtue-based systems are sometimes called arete ethics, from the Greek arete, which we translate as excellence or virtue. By contrast, action-based theories emphasize the need to act according to moral rules, such as the utilitarian principle or the categorical imperative. And the central moral question for this approach is, what should I do? These theories are sometimes referred to as rule-governed because of their emphasis on acting according to rules, or deontic, a term that incorporates both utilitarian and deontological reliance on action guiding rules. Action-based ethics lack a motivational component. The deontological systems may be uninspiring is illustrated by their largely negative nature. Most of the commandments and rules in such systems are inherently negative. Thou shalt not plank, as Mill complain about the so-called Christian morality of the Victorian age. Christian morality, so-called, has all the characters of a reaction. It is in great part a protest against paganism. Its ideal is negative rather than positive, passive rather than active, innocence rather than nobleness, abstinence from evil rather than energetic pursuit of the good. In its precepts, thou shalt not predominates unduly over thou shalt. Whatever exists of magnanimity, high-mindedness, personal dignity, even the sense of honor is derived from the purely human, not the religious part of our education, and never could have grown out of a standard of ethics, in which the only word professedly recognized is that of obedience. Action-based ethics are founded on an obsolete theological legal model. In 1958, Cambridge University philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe published a watershed article, Modern Moral Philosophy, in which he argued that it is not profitable for us at present to do moral philosophy until we have an adequate philosophical psychology, and that our concepts of moral obligation and moral duty are derived from a theological legal tradition that is no longer the dominant worldview. In this regard, the legalistic approach in modern moral theory has the effect of undermining the spirit of morality. Morality was made for man, not man for morality. Rules often get in the way of kindness and spontaneous generosity. Action-based ethics ignore the spontaneous dimension of ethics. Virtue theorists also charge that action-based ethics reduce all moral assessments to judgments about actions. By doing so, action-based ethics neglect the spontaneous aspect of moral conduct that emerges from a person's ingrained qualities of gratitude, self-respect, sympathy, having one's emotions in proper order, and aspiring to become a certain kind of person. Action-based ethics are minimalist and neglect the development of character. So David L. Norton has argued for a fundamental distinction between traditional action-based ethics and classical virtue ethics. Traditional action-based ethics tends to be minimalist, calling on us to adhere to a core of necessary rules. For example, do not steal, harm, murder, or lie for society to function. The accent is on social control. Morality is largely preventive, safeguarding rights and moral space where people may carry out their projects, unhindered by the intrusions of others. Daniel Callahan characterizes such a moral minimalist ethic this way. It has been one that stressed the transcendence of the individual over the community, the need to tolerate all moral viewpoints, the autonomy of the self as the highest human good, the informed consent contract as the model of human relationships. We are obliged under the most generous reading of a minimalist ethic only to honor our voluntarily undertaken family obligations, to keep our promises, and to respect contracts freely, entered into with other freely consenting adults. Beyond those minimal standards, we are free to do as we like, guided by nothing other than our private standards of good and evil. Action-based ethics overemphasize autonomy and neglect community. In his book, After Virtue, 1981, Alasdair MacIntyre argues that rule-governed ethics is a symptom of the Enlightenment, which exaggerated the principle of autonomy, that is, the ability of each person to arrive at the moral code by reason alone. However, MacIntyre maintains all moral codes are rooted in practices that themselves are rooted in tradition or forms of life. We do not make moral decisions as rational atoms in a vacuum, and it is sheer ideological blindness that allows this distorted perception. MacIntyre does not want to embrace relativism. We can discover better ways of living, but they will probably be founded on an account of what the good life is and what a good community is. Connections between virtue-based and action-based ethics. So far, we've seen the tension that exists between virtue-based and action-based ethics. Which approach is right, if either? Can the two be reconciled with each other? There are three basic relationships that might exist between virtues and moral rules, and all of them are positions held today by various philosophers. In this section and the following, we examine these positions. Briefly, here are the three relationships. First, pure virtue-based ethics. The virtues are dominant and have intrinsic value. Moral rules or duties are derived from the virtues. For example, if we claim that we have a duty to be just or beneficent, we must discover the virtues of fairness and benevolence in the good person. Second, the standard action-based view. And the third is the complementarity or pluralistic ethics. So let's elaborate and to understand more the connections between virtue-based and action-based ethics. So let's look at each in more detail, and I will give it to Ms. Marisol Macra.
We will tackle about the standard action-based ethics, the correspondence ethics. The standard action-based view acknowledges moral virtues but gives them a secondary status. This view has three theses. Number 1. The action nature of the rules thesis. Moral rules require the person to perform or omit certain actions, and these actions can be performed by persons who lack the various virtues as well as by those who possess them. For example, both the benevolent and those who lack benevolence can perform beneficent acts such as giving to charity. Second, the reductionist thesis. The moral virtues are a disposition to obey the moral rules, that is, to perform or omit certain actions. For example, the virtue of benevolence is a disposition to carry out the duty to perform beneficent acts. According to the correspondence theory of virtues, each virtues correspond to an appropriate moral principle. The next is number 3, the instrumental value thesis. The moral virtues have no intrinsic value but do have instrumental and derivative value. Agents who have the virtues are more likely to do the right acts, that is, obey the rules. The virtues are important only because they motivate right actions. The quote, William Friedkin, "Traits without principles are blind." Whether this is a virtue, there must be some possible action to which the virtue corresponds and from which it is derived its virtueness. For example, the character traits of truthfulness is a virtue because telling the truth in general is a moral duty. And now, let's move on to pluralistic, the complementary ethics. The virtue-based ethicists will not be satisfied with the standard action-based view and its correspondence theory, because it is still reductionistic, treating the virtues like second-class citizens, like servants of the master rules. Even if virtue theorists agree that virtue-based ethics cannot stand alone, they will not accept this kind of reductionism. There must be, through complementary, a recognition of importance of both rules and virtues in ways that do not exhaust either. Some instance of carrying out the rule may be done without a virtue, and some virtues will be prized for their own sake even without any correspondence to a moral duty. This is the view of pluralistic ethics, derived from the term plural, meaning more than one. To clarify, let's recall three theses of the standard action-based view. Number 1. The action nature of the rules thesis. Second, the reductionist thesis. And the third one, the instrumental value thesis. Pluralistic ethnicists, like virtue tourists, must reject all three in order to elevate virtues from their second-class status and put them on an equal level with moral rules. Let's begin with the first. The first one is the action nature of rules thesis. Moral rules require the person to perform or omit certain actions, and this action can be performed by a person who lack the values virtues as well as by those who possesses them. And the second one, the reductionist thesis. The moral virtues are disposition to obey the moral rules. That is, to perform or omit certain actions. According to the correspondence theory of virtues, each virtue corresponds to an appropriate moral principle. The third one is instrumental value thesis. The moral virtue have no intrinsic value but do have instrumental and derivative value. The virtues are important only because they motivate right action. So the conclusion for this is, virtue-based ethics possess a significant challenge to standard action-based ethical theories. It is doubtful whether the standard action-based ethicist will be satisfied with the pluralistic thesis or virtues as set forth in this chapter. But we must leave the matter here exactly where it is in the contemporary debate.
What is important is that we recognize that principles without character are impotent, and that the virtues enliven the principles and empower the moral life in general. The question is not whether these accounts were wrong in what they said, but whether they were adequate to the complete moral life. And the references, I get all of that from the textbook. So, thank you for listening, and I hope you understand what we discuss or report. And once again, we are the Group 6. I'm Erlyn Jade Geiger, and my member is Miss Marisol Galo Macra. Thank you once again.